There we go. We should be live. So we'll kill that. Got to be careful talking about killing things on YouTube. I'm gonna get an algorithm angry. Okay, let's post out this link. It's funny, people are asking about if we're going to have the audio format out yet, and we're still waiting on some stuff. We need to get a couple things hammered out before we do that. And
yeah,
so I'm out here doing advertisements for YouTube Premium, telling people go buy YouTube Premium, give YouTube $15 so that you can listen to us.
That's funny.
Yeah, it is what it is. Senate passes COVID-19 hate crimes bill. What on earth? The COVID-19 hate crimes
I'm 1,000% sure I'm going to jail because of it. I have no idea. I've not even heard of it. I know it's going to put me in jail.
Holy crap. Okay, so it would, among other initiatives, direct the Justice Department to more speedily review pandemic-related hate crimes. Pandemic-related hate crimes.
Yep. I'm going. Yep. I'm done. This is what gets me.
Literally anything can be a pandemic-related hate crime.
And just remember, it doesn't matter who you elect president. We just want to revisit that as much as possible. You guys are real big brain.
And expand data collection resources for tracking such crimes.
Cool.
Holy, yep. And listen to this. The chamber approved the bill by a vote of 94-1. 94-1. The single vote in opposition was
Massey.
No. Josh Hawley. This is the Senate.
Yeah.
Josh Hawley. The legislation will next head to the House for consideration, which of course it'll pass. Man, if it passed 94-1 because these frickin' Republicans are such a bunch of pussies because they don't want to be the guy on record having voted against the Hate Crime Act.
Yep.
Man, oh my God. Democrats are just absolutely ruthless. This is the most savage political move anyone has made in a long time. Holy crap. Okay. Man, okay, our goal wasn't to talk about the hate crimes, the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, but man,
so getting prosecuted for a hate crime. It's not a joke. It's just where I live, and oh boy,
you're gonna get prosecuted for a hate crime for something like having your store open on the wrong day.
Yeah. Yep.
Good grief.
Yep. Oh boy.
All right. Well, welcome aboard, folks. This is another episode of King Pilled. Welcome back to King Pilled. Welcome to King Pilled if you've never been here before.
Hello, Liberty lovers.
Oh my God. Well, now we have to stop.
We talked about this in the pre-show.
Man.
I mean, we committed that we were gonna start the show off in a particular way each time. I'm pretty sure we settled on "Good morning, Liberty lovers." Was I wrong?
I quit. I want nothing to do with this show ever again.
Welcome to the King Show, fans.
If you haven't listened to us here before, you would know that you wouldn't know that I am extremely I do not at all care for the term Liberty lovers. It sounds extremely I'm not allowed to say the word. It sounds extremely bundle of sticksy to me. The extremely, a bundle of sticks is a fascia, so it sounds extremely fascist to me. That's what it is.
Yes.
Liberty lovers is fascist.
Yeah, fascist.
Carlos, what's up, buddy? He says he's ready to learn some new Moldbug info without having to read any. That's what we're about here. We are here so you can learn about Moldbug without having to read Moldbug. I guess you could. That might be our tagline.
Pinche Moldbug.
Pinche. So we're going to do another live reading of Moldbug. We're going to do chapter 2 of the Mises to Carlisle series today. And It is think of this as sort of like listening to an audiobook, kind of, except this audiobook provides live commentary. And we'll kind of weigh in, we'll interpret. One thing that Moldbug does that you don't get if someone just does like an artificial intelligence just automated reading of his writings, you don't get all of the embedded hyperlinks because he links to a bunch of stuff that he references or as support or something for particular points. And sometimes he just kind of vaguely alludes to them in the text. And if you're reading it, you'll see the link. And so you'll understand he's referring to something else. And you can go click and read about it, which is very easy to just get caught into just a never ending downward spiral, reading more and more and not actually getting back to the original content. But if you're just listening to somebody read it, then you don't necessarily know that that's there. So one thing that we'll do here as we're going through is every time that there's a hyperlink, if it seems relevant to the subject, then I'll click on it and I'll go give you a quick rundown of what that is to try to give you a bit of background on the what he's trying to say. So, but before we get into that, I want to read through this thread by good friend of the show, Popular Liberty, on Twitter. He and I have been talking the last couple of days a little more, and we're going to be talking a whole lot more going forward. I've been listening to a couple of the videos that he did on YouTube on his channel, Popular Liberty, about the laws of archetropism. And archetropism is a neologism. It's a word that he coined to describe a specific phenomenon. So in the videos, he defines archetropism. It's from two Greek words, archos and tropos, and archos being like ruler, so something pertaining to a ruler, and then tropos meaning to turn. And so what he's describing archetropism is the process by which people turn toward rulers, or more specifically, the way that a state seeds chaos to deliberately seeds chaos to provide themselves an opportunity to impose order. And it's the way that state actors expand their power. And this applies this could apply in any situation, but it particularly applies with respect to the left. And so one of our goals is to persuade people, first of all, that politics is war. And if you're fighting a war, you're not really concerned about what action is moral and immoral. You're more concerned about which action keeps me alive and which doesn't. So this is a modern form of warfare. So it's not so that the definitions of the playing field has changed. So your definitions have to change and your understanding has to change, but the rules still apply. So we want to be very clear that we don't advocate violence. We don't want people to go out and engage in violence. Number one, because we think it's wrong generally, but number two, because it's just it's impractical. It's counterproductive. You are actively hurting your cause, because when you go out and you engage in violence, willy-nilly, you're actually creating chaos for your enemies to profit from. This is what happened on January 6th. Those people went and they engaged in violent acts, or something that it could at least be portrayed as violent, because perception is reality. And they created the perfect platform for every expansion of leftist politician power imaginable. They've created that pretext by going and engaging in violence. So engaging in violence is extremely counterproductive, and we don't advocate it for anybody. However, you still must understand that if you're going to engage in the political process, what you're doing is you're engaging in a form of warfare. Politics and war are just on a continuum. When you have a political system, it always arises out of some form of conflict. So there was a conflict. The two sides, rather than one fighting the other one to the death, the two sides agree to terms. And as part of those terms, a pretext is established for ultimately two sides of a political process. And so one side typically is going to value one thing while the other side values the other thing. And they are attempting to impose their will on the other one. But part of the terms of the agreement is that they're not going to engage in violence, and that they're only going to impose their will according to a specific set of rules. So you have to understand those rules, and you have to understand how the parties to the conflict, how they implement those rules, and how they are bound or not bound by them. In the case of the left, they love to the right side of the conflict loves to establish. They love the rules. Then they really just identify themselves with the rules. So they want to establish themselves as the people who are most consistently faithful to the rules, because their misunderstanding of the terrain of battle here is that those who are the most consistently faithful to the rules are the ones who win. And in fact, that's not the case. The one who wins is the one who can break the rules and get away with it. And so because the right side of the conflict never wants to hold the left side accountable, they want to talk about it, they want to point out that they broke the rules, but they don't ever punish them for breaking the rules. So for that reason, there's no incentive to stop breaking the rules. So for this reason, then, the left side of the conflict uses the rules against the right side of the conflict to expand their own power. And this actually makes it much easier for them, because if it was just one body that dominated everything, it would be much harder for that body to expand its own power, because everybody would be focused on it. That's why a one-party state is much more unstable than a two-party state. A two-party state is much more stable because there can at least be the impression of something constraining the dominant force or the tyrannical force. So if your goal, just speaking from a strategic point, if your goal is to try to expand your power as much as possible, it serves you well to uphold a foil for yourself. This is part of the reason why I think this idea that Republicans will never win another election, I think that's not entirely true. I think that the spirit of the argument is true, which is that if you're focused on the political process at this point and just trying to like preserve election integrity, you've lost already. That's just that ship has sailed, that Rubicon has been crossed, and you need to get with the program. However, if your goal is to use the political process strategically here or there, that's viable. But anyway, so I kind of forgot what I was saying. I kind of forgot my train of thought there. But the fact of the matter is, this archotropism concept that Popular Liberty has introduced is basically a way of understanding that this whole conflict is not a moral conflict. It's an engineering conflict. We have an engineering problem. If we want liberty, it's going to be something that we have to obtain through engineering. Trying to persuade people misses out on what's going on. You don't persuade people to stop fighting when they have the upper hand. If you're on a battlefield and people have the upper hand against you, you're not going to like talk them into, you're not going to like sell them on the idea of not killing you. I mean, unless you're the best salesperson ever and you have the best sales pitch in the world, and whatever you're offering them is worth more than whatever they can just take from you. That's very rare. There's very rare that you actually have something like that can be communicated that way. And that's what libertarians and conservatives think that they're doing. They think that they're somehow on a level playing field with the left, and they aren't, because the left are the ones defining the terms of the conflict. The rules, the formal rules are one thing. The informal rules, the rules that are actually played by, those are the ones that determine the outcome. So conservatives and libertarians are playing on the formal playing field, the playing field that everyone pretends to be playing on, but the field that the left is playing on is the actual playing field where things actually happen. They play by a completely different set of rules, and the rules are power. Everything is about power, obtaining power at any cost. And so Popular Liberty has identified this, and he's boiled it down to taking the idea of this being an engineering problem. He said, okay, well, what are the laws of this universe that we're engaging with? What are the laws of power? If we look at them just from a natural sense, like you're evaluating a natural phenomenon, what do you derive from that? And so he took the laws of power and he applied the laws of thermodynamics, the laws of physics, which is interesting because you got this order chaos dynamic. So he was like, hey, let's apply the laws of physics and see if these help us explain what's going on. And boy, do they ever explain. This is one of the most powerful ways of understanding politics that I've ever heard. And a lot of these are familiar ideas that you'll have heard many of them before, but you probably won't have heard it explained in this way. And when it is explained, it's going to make a hell of a lot of sense to you. But Popular Liberty's out here jamming on the comments already. So we'll catch up on those in a little bit. First of all, I wanted to shout out to our sponsor. Carlos was in here just a little bit ago. Carlos and Vanessa Abelard are really good people. And they've started a company called Paloma Verde. They sell CBD products. It's fantastic CBD. They sent when Steven and I, when we first had this advertising agreement, they sent Steven and I a little package, a sampler of their goods, and I've bought their stuff in the past as well. My favorite is their gummies. They've got these green apple flavored CBD gummies, 10 milligrams in each one. I've been taking those each night before I go to sleep for the last week, and it's the best sleep that I've had in years. I'm having way more vivid dreams, and I'm remembering them. And I lay down and I'm right asleep. And when my alarm goes off, I wake up and I can't go back to sleep. Even if I wake up a little bit early, I can't go back to sleep because I'm rested and I'm ready to go. And then I don't have the muscle rub that they sent, but they sent me a little thing of the muscle rub, and rubbing that on. I constantly have back problems. I picked up my son yesterday and I thought I smelled poop, so I went to lift him up and bend down and try and sniff his diaper, and immediately I threw my upper back out. So I'm old, and the CBD muscle rub is fantastic. I rubbed a little bit of it up in there, and the nerve pain kind of chilled out a little. So I was much more functional yesterday. Anyway, so if you go to palomaverdestore.com and use promo code KING, then you'll get 25% off any order over $75. We've already had several people. Our audience is according to most podcasts, our compared to most podcasts, our audience is small, and we've already had a bunch of people go over and buy from them and use our promo codes. That's fantastic. We really appreciate it. It shows them that you appreciate our show and that you got to them through us. And then it shows us that you appreciate our show as well. So go to palomaverdestore.com.
It shows other podcasts that they ain't shit also.
That's right.
Their audience is stuck compared to ours. We have better audiences.
You know, if you ask the people who appreciate being serviced, the being bigger is not always better. Sometimes smaller is better. It just goes to how you use it, to how you use your the tool at your disposal. That's what really matters. Anyways,
you know what I want to do right now, but I can't do, and I can only do it in the supporting listeners group. And you know it's very unfair that you would tempt me to do this.
What's funny is if you go,
I really want to do it, but the fans in the supporting listeners group for sure they've either already heard it or they'll hear it soon.
Oh yeah, they all know exactly what you're talking about.
Right. Yeah.
Yep. If you go over to, if you go listen to Popular Liberty's videos on archetropism, one thing that a little meme that he's begun that I want to pick up on is he's talking about monarchists and then like monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy. But democracy, there's like this cycle. They always go through this cycle. Starts out with a monarchy, eventually devolves into an oligarchy, and then becomes a democracy. But every democracy, in fact, is actually an oligarchy because democracy doesn't function. They have to elect or appoint or trust leaders to make decisions for them. So every democracy is in fact an oligarchy. So then you really just have oligarchy and monarchy. So he wants to refer to Democrats, the people who don't want oligarchy or monarchy, the people who want democracy. But he wants to differentiate them from the Democrat Party. So he was calling them little d Democrats. And then he said they are little d. They're very little d. You know, they've got real issues down there. So the little d Democrats, all Democrats are little d Democrats in our world. But anyways, okay. So before we dive into the mold bug, I just wanted to go through this thread from Popular Liberty that he did a couple weeks ago. I'm just going to read through it here. So he says you can go follow him on Twitter at Popular Liberty, and the first O in popular is a 0. So at P0 Pular Liberty. P0 Pular Liberty.
What an SEO nightmare.
If you look up Popular Liberty, you'll find him. It comes up right away. Okay, so to properly understand the right, left, and libertarians, you need to understand the evolutionary roles they each play, which their respective political beliefs are all manifestations of. Once you understand each, you understand why evangelism and debate are unfruitful. Starting from the left, they play the role of predator, being highly sensitive to the laws of power and very insensitive to the laws of production. They opt for the former and have no understanding of the latter. He's creating this dynamic this dichotomy between production and predation. So there's two ways that you can get something else. You can either produce it or you can take it from someone. So you either have production or you have predation. So the left only understands the laws of predation. They don't understand the laws of production. It's as if they can't see the color gold for production. Because they can't see the colors of the economic production incentive systems, but can very vividly see all the colors of the predation system, they naturally assume that predation and exploitation are all that exist. This colorblindness explains why the left projects its beliefs and behaviors onto everyone else. They can't see what the right and libertarians see. It's invisible to them. Thus, for them, everything is rationally a struggle for predation and exploitation. This is why you'll hear them say that it's all about power. This is like one of the postmodern things, that it all comes down to power. That's a derivation of postmodernism, because everything is narratives and meta-narratives. So whatever narrative has the most power is the one that will win out, and everyone else will abide by that narrative. So
straight up Alinsky.
Right, yeah. That's so this starts getting into why the left always wins and always will win unless they are crushed, because they only believe in predation, so it's the only rule that they can follow. If you try to build a society based on production, where people who produce are the ones who rise to the top, then the left will always be predating unless they've been held back. They were always going to be engaged in the process of predation, in the process of acting like a predator, because that's what the left is. The left is fundamentally predatory. The right, thus they embody the evolutionary role as society's predators and highest time preference consumers. That's an important thing. The left is high time preference. The right is low time preference, ostensibly. So that's part of predation. Because the left is high time preference, they don't have the low time preference necessary for production. So they engage in predation. I'm just going to take it from you. I'm not going to make my own. I'm just going to take yours. That's high time preference. This is also why the left's most right-wing members are disproportionately represented in entrepreneurial innovation. They can vividly see the weaknesses in systems. So if you want to be an effective producer, one of the best ways to do that is to make existing systems more efficient. If you make existing systems more efficient, then you can produce more. To do that, you have to see the weakness in the system. If you find the weakness in the system, you can improve it and you can make a better system. So people who are on the left, but who are the most production oriented, still have the left's capacity for predation, for the capacity for seeking out the weak spot in a system and taking advantage of it. So the ones who have that capacity, but then they're inclined to production, they wind up becoming the best producers, the best entrepreneurs. So this is why you'll see Silicon Valley tends toward leftism, because they tend to be the most predatory, or the most production-oriented of the predators. The right, by contrast, is much less sensitive to the laws of power, or archetropism, and they are much more sensitive to the laws of production, but they are not entirely blind to the laws of power either. They can see both sets of colors, but neither fully. So what he's setting up here is a dichotomy where you have the left, and then you have libertarians, and you have the right in the middle. And this is in the context of an American system, of a Western democratic system. I haven't thought about this outside that, if this would apply outside that sort of system, but this is the system we have. This is the only one that exists in the world effectively. So this is where it's most important that it applies. So the right is not as sensitive to the laws of power as the left, but they're not entirely sensitive to the laws of production either. They understand production by and large, but they don't understand it fully. So they can see both sets of colors, but neither fully. As a consequence of being able to see both sets of colors, predation and production, but the former much less vividly, the right naturally takes on the evolutionary role as the guardians and producers of society. They understand the need to guard production with predation. So they're balanced between the two. They are inclined toward production, but they also understand predation. And so the people who can understand both sides of the conversation, those are the ones who are going to tend toward being the guardians, being the facilitators, being the MCs, kind of. And getting to libertarians then. I like that when he says the right understands the need to guard production with predation. Libertarians are the least sensitive to the laws of power and predation, and the most sensitive to the laws of production. Production, however, doesn't come naturally for man, as we spent millions of years without it, surviving entirely on predation, which is why most people can see the colors of predation with some ease, despite the colors of production being the ones responsible for every good thing in society. So even though production is what has given us basically every good thing in society. People in general are much more in tune with predation because that's what we are biologically adapted to. The humans who survived to engage in production were the ones who were most gifted at predation because they were the ones who preyed on and destroyed everyone else. And that gave them the luxury of the peace to start practicing production. So we're the descendants of predators, and we're those who adapt to our basest instincts adapt toward being predatory. It's an evolution toward production. So we're talking about a more evolved psychology than a less evolved, more base psychology. Not to be confused with a based psychology. It's a base psychology. Leftism is. So this is why. This is the main reason the right struggles to port their views to reality. The laws of production that they see very vivid, or this is libertarians. Libertarians struggle to port their views to reality because the laws of production that they see very vividly are invisible to most people because lefties are the majority. They're not visible to the right, but worse, the laws of power that everyone else sees are invisible to libertarians. Libertarians don't understand the nature of power whatsoever. They recognize. It's like they recognize tyranny when they see it or they think they do, but they don't understand where it comes from. And so for that reason, they don't really understand what tyranny actually is. They just kind of have a vague instinct for it. This is the major reason that debate and dialogue are fruitless. Each side is colorblind to the invisible incentive systems the other sides are living in. To the extent that conversions happen, they're really just cases of mistaken self-identities being corrected. Mostly, these folks had simply followed the herd of their peer groups into an identity that didn't make sense to them based upon their particular colorblindness, and upon identifying their real worldview peer groups, self-corrected to the new identity they were evolved for. So it might be a person who had evolved for a right-wing identity, but they just kind of followed the left just because it's sort of like they understand the laws of predation. They don't fully understand the laws of production. But once they fully understand it, then they're like, oh, okay, that makes sense to me. So really, I'm actually on the right. I'm not on the left. That's not someone who was a leftist who became a rightist. That's just someone who thought he was a leftist, but once he learned more, it just was a phenomenon of his cultural position. And really, if you're trying to persuade people, that's what you're doing. You're trying to find the people who don't belong. You're trying to find the ones who don't fit in, who think that they're following this crowd, but they're just like, I don't really identify with that. Like I'm feeling kind of disenchanted or disenfranchised by that. But those are like, by definition, those are the exception. They're not the rule. Eventually, you're going to run out of people like that. They're all going to move to your side, but you're still going to be dealing with, because with the left being about predation, being predatory, they don't have to be a majority to win. It's a small intolerant minority that always wins because they're the ones who are the most predatory. So they make up for their lesser numbers with greater enthusiasm or with aggressiveness or with proactivity. Everyone else is sitting around waiting for someone else to act, and they take the action and dictate other people's reactions. They're the ones who start moving the puck, and so they're the ones who end up controlling the situation, even if they might be relatively smaller in number. So anyways, that was the whole extent of the thread. If you want to learn more about the laws of archotropism, just look in the show notes on the bottom of the video as soon as this is done, and I'll put the link to Popular Liberty's YouTube channel, or you can look up archotropism. It's spelled A-R-C-H, like anarchy, A-R-C-H-O-T-R-O-P-I-S-M. If you look up archotropism, it's a word he coined just recently, so his results are going to be the only ones that you find. And then go follow him at Popular Liberty with a 0 in the space of the first O, or the only O, actually. Okay. So let's see where we're at here. Get us started on reading Why Carlyle Matters. So the first half of this is going to be a little dry. Maybe the first third or so is a little dry. It's kind of interesting. But it's not the real meat of the piece. It's just kind of some random thoughts that Yarvin had, Moldbug had, as he was writing it out. And so he kind of went down a little rabbit trail. But once it starts getting going more toward the middle of the piece, this is even better or more groundbreaking or more enlightening, at least for me, than the first one was. The first one was kind of like a bolt of lightning in the night, but this one here is like the fire that the bolt of lightning started. This is where things start really getting good. So if you find your eyes glazing over a little bit through the first half of this, I'm going to kind of just try to push through it as much as possible, because I did advertise this as a live reading of the piece. But if you're finding your eyes glazing over, just bear with us. I'll try to make it as interesting as possible, and then we'll get into the real meat of it. So this is Moldbug on Carlisle, Chapter 2, Why Carlisle Matters. Mencius Moldbug, July 16, 2009. Let me take a drink of water first.
Strap in, folks.
Oh yeah, before I get started, did you have anything you wanted to add to the earlier conversation?
I completely disagree with everything that was said, but I'm just going to keep it to myself.
Okay. If there is one writer in English whose name can be uttered with Shakespeare's, it is Carlyle. If we need a third, we can add Johnson, Johnson being Samuel Johnson. Chaucer is too foreign. Shakespeare, Carlyle, and Johnson. Do you notice a pattern? If not, you're probably new to UR, or Unqualified Reservations, the blog that he's writing in. If you're not quite sure who Carlyle and Johnson were, much glorious learning awaits you. Fortunately, you get to learn Johnson on your own. I know very little about the 18th century. And when he says he knows very little, it's like, oh,
more than anyone that you know.
Yes, he knows. He's like someone who got their doctorate and has been a professor teaching about the 18th century for 10 years. That's going to be about Moldbug's level of knowledge of the 18th century. When he says, I don't really know about it, it's because every other century, he knows more than any other human being in history, because the dude, somehow, he's like a machine for just reading books, just churning out books and memorizing everything in them. There's a reason that when he talks on like a podcast, he's a little hard to listen to. It's because his thing isn't talking. His thing is writing, and his thing is reading. Like reading and writing are what he was made to do. So yeah, when he says that he doesn't know much about the 18th century, he's being too modest. But you will find precious few who have read all three, that is, Shakespeare, Carlyle, and Samuel Johnson. You will find precious few who have read all three and will quarrel with this trinity, and all of them are fools, in my view. Then again, I named my daughter after Carlyle. If you are wiser and reserve your judgment, please allow me to etch away one or two of your reservations. First, it is no daring literary act to exalt Carlyle as superhuman. Like Johnson, he was exalted as superhuman in his own time. Indeed, the proper way to introduce Carlyle is through the eyes of his peers, some of whom are still remembered. For example, one American wrote, quote, "The way to test how much he has left his country were to consider, or to try to consider, for a moment, the array of British thought, the resultant ensemble of the last 50 years, as existing today, but with Carlyle left out. It would be like an army with no artillery." End quote. That was Walt Whitman in his 1881 obituary. People still read Whitman, but not Carlyle. There's a reason for this. It's still not necessarily a good reason. Because Whitman's point of view, about as close as it comes to NPR avant la lettre, is so easy for the good citizen of 2009 to masticate, his introduction to Carlyle may be the best available. You see, the basic reason Carlyle is not in your high school English reader, whereas Whitman is that Carlyle was what, here at UR, we call a reactionary, whereas Whitman is a progressive, or in 19th century parlance, a radical. A reaction is not a Republican, a Democrat, or even a Libertarian. It is not even a communist, a fascist, or a monarchist. It is something much older, stranger, and more powerful. But if you can describe it as anything, you can describe it as the pure opposite of progressivism. True reaction is long since extinct in the wild, but it lives in Carlyle, whose writings are now and forever available at a click, even though they may be illegal in most states and the European Union. But let Whitman introduce us. Quote, "All that is comprehended under the terms republicanism and democracy were distasteful to Carlyle from the first, and as he grew older they became hateful and contemptible. For an undoubtedly candid and penetrating faculty such as his, the bearings he persistently ignored were marvelous. For instance, the promise, nay certainty, of the democratic principle to each and every state of the current world not so much of helping it to perfect legislators and executives, but as the only effectual method for surely, however slowly, training people on a large scale toward voluntarily ruling and managing themselves, the ultimate aim of political and all other development. To gradually reduce the fact of governing to its minimum, and to subject all its staffs and their doings to the telescopes and microscopes of committees and parties. And greatest of all, to afford, not stagnation in obedient content, which went well enough with the feudalism and ecclesiasticism of the antique and medieval world, but a vast and sane and recurrent ebb and tide action for those floods of the great deep that have henceforth palpably burst forever from their their old bounds, seem never to have entered Carlyle's thought. That was the longest sentence that I've ever read. And if you fell asleep in the middle of the sentence, basically what he's saying is that Carlyle doesn't get that the whole purpose of democracy is to teach people how to govern themselves and then gradually remove governance more and more and more until everyone is just getting along. And he just doesn't understand that that's how it works. For whatever reason, that's just never occurred to him. That's basically what he's saying. It was splendid how he refused any compromise to the last. He was curiously antique. In that harsh, picturesque, most potent voice and figure, one seems to be carried back from the present of the British Islands more than 2,000 years to the range between Jerusalem and Tarsus. His fullest, best biographer justly says of him, so now Whitman is quoting someone else, he was a teacher and a prophet in the Jewish sense of the word. The prophecies of Isaiah and Jeremiah have become a part of the permanent spiritual inheritance of mankind, because events prove that they had interpreted correctly the signs of their own times and their prophecies were fulfilled. Carlyle, like them, believed that he had a special message to deliver to the present age. Whether he was correct in that belief and whether his message was a true message remains to be seen. He has told us that our most cherished ideas of political liberty, with their kindred corollaries, are mere illusions, and that the progress which has seemed to go along with them is a progress toward anarchy and social dissolution. If he was wrong, he has misused his powers. The principles of his teachings are false. He has offered himself as a guide upon a road of which he had no knowledge, and his own desire for himself would be the speediest oblivion both of his person and his works. If, on the other hand, he has been right, if, like his great predecessors, he has read truly the tendencies of this modern age of ours, and his teaching is authenticated by facts, then Carlyle, too, will take his place among the inspired seers. End quote of Carlyle's biographer, back to Whitman. To which I add an amendment that under no circumstances, and no matter how completely time and events disprove his lurid vaticinations, not vaccinations, vaticinations, should the English-speaking world forget this man, nor fail to hold in honor his unsurpassed conscience, his unique method, and his honest fame. Never were convictions more earnest and genuine, never was there less of a flunky or temporizer. Never had political progressivism a foe it could more heartily respect. Then I find no better text. It is always important to have a definite, special, even oppositional living man to start from, for sending out certain speculations and comparisons for home use. Let us see what they amount to. Those reactionary doctrines, fears, scornful analyses of democracy, even from the most erudite and sincere mind of Europe. So basically, he's saying that he disagrees with Carlyle, but he respects his scholarship and his passion and his willingness to kind of go out on a limb. And so he's like, even though we completely disagree, I respect the guy. And if he's right, then we were all blind and, so much the worse for all of us. Either way, it's worth reading what he has to say just in case he's right. Because if he was right, it would be a terrible thing. So we want to just make sure that he's not right, even though we know he's not right. That's kind of what he's saying. Back to Moldbug. We slipped some Froude, Carlyle's disciple as well as his biographer, in there with the Whitman. But the quote is Whitman's own. Is it not a measure of Whitman's own greatness, the arch poet of democracy triumphant, that he gives such props to such a pure opponent? If Whitman can worship Carlyle and quote Froude, what Whitmans are there today? There are two ways to process Carlyle in 2009. One is to buy in with Whitman. Of course, Carlyle was wrong as a prophet, though we acknowledge his importance as a writer. Well, actually, most of us don't, but a few professors will always have no choice. As another contemporary critic, this one mercifully forgotten, and this is, I can't see which book this is. Smell Fungus? I don't know what this, I've never heard of this. It's a book called Carlyle Redivivius, an occasional discourse on Sourtag. See, this is the type of stuff that like how does he possibly know like what this book is? How does he possibly have this thing to go just read and quote from? The man is a machine. So anyways, this guy is apparently a contemporary critic of Carlyle, and he said this: by common consent, or nearly so, Mr. Carlyle died our greatest English man of letters. Of this claim on his behalf, which includes, of course, a recognition of him as a great intellectual and spiritual force, there can be scarce, I should say, be much question. But one might very well admire Mr. Carlyle as a literateur in this higher and larger sense, yet have only a modified belief in him as a prophet, and question altogether his title to be called, except in a rather loose and inexact way, a great thinker and philosopher. So in other words, he's saying he's a very, very good writer, but he doesn't predict things very well, and his philosophy really isn't all that much to write home about. And what's funny is that basically these guys said that if Carlyle's predictions were accurate, he should be like the greatest man of all time. But his predictions aren't going to be accurate. But then his predictions turned out to be accurate. And the intellectual descendants of these guys aren't even remotely interested in considering Carlyle the greatest prophet of all time, because he was actually predicted the way things are now. He was so right that even the people who criticized him then, their intellectual descendants won't acknowledge just how right he was. Back to Moldbug. From this perspective, just as Froude describes, Carlyle misused his Vedic powers. I'm going to see what that word means. Vedic means describing or predicting what will happen in the future. Interesting. Okay, new word. From this perspective, just as Froude describes, Carlyle misused his Vedic powers on behalf of, quote, the cultural evils of 19th century Britain, which was a quote from one of Carlyle's letters. It's taking too long to load, but it's a Carlyleism. The cultural evils of 19th century Britain. So he misused his Vedic powers on behalf of the cultural evils of 19th century Britain and has suffered that justified oblivion which all false prophets deserve and receive, evil having since been eradicated in Britain, of course. If it can be swallowed in the 21st century with a straight face, a task demanding no small strength of gullet, this is a safe antidote which detoxifies Carlyle and renders him safe for antiseptic scholarship of the Dryasdust school. The Dryasdust school. Dryasdust was an imaginary and tediously thorough literary authority cited by Sir Walter Scott to present background information in his novels. Thereafter, a derisory term for anyone who presents historical facts with no feeling for the personalities involved. Okay, so alternatively, one can embrace the dark side and simply study Carlyle, and of course his era, as the adversary, Satan personified. This is even safer, as the dead do not shoot back. But hell has a carrel and a stipend for everyone who studied the past because he despised it, and a big corner office for those in the actual business of actual libel. Kids, if you hate your ancestors, hold your tongues. You will not feel like such fools later. And he linked to things when he said a big corner office for those in the actual business. And he linked to the Wikipedia for the Late Victorian Holocausts, which was a book by Mike Davis about the connection between political economy and global climate patterns, particularly El Nino Southern Oscillation. By comparing Enzo episodes in different time periods and across countries, Davis explores the impact of colonialism and the introduction of capitalism and the relation with famine in particular. So the guy's writing a book where he's basically saying that capitalism is responsible for famine, and he's calling that effectively libel. And then okay. The trouble with studying 19th century Britain from the 20th century American point of view is that no Victorianist can think seriously of a modern career in the field unless he shoots only through one or both of these two orthodox angles. Dry as dust, where you're just describing something as fact and you have no association with it whatsoever, or Hesperus Fiddlestring, which is Latter-day Pamphlets by Thomas Carlyle. I think it's a quote from Carlyle in the Google book, but I'm not going to read it right now. Either camera can churn out any amount of scholarly product, but neither can be handled by anyone with an actual soul. The literary value of both together is about that of Marx Lenin studies, though the former is useful from a strictly clerical standpoint. Indeed, the Soviet understanding of the Victorians was exactly the same as ours, modulo a little Marx. If you did not have a soul, however, you probably would not have found your way to you are. Likewise, a brain. And this brain cannot fail to have had a certain reaction to Mr. Whitman's argument against Mr. Carlyle. Was that reaction by any chance, or what? Or okay, or sure, I guess. For example, when Whitman castigates Carlyle for not realizing that democracy will gradually reduce the fact of governing to its minimum, or perfect legislators and executives, or, best of all, train its own voting citizens on a large scale to be every year wiser and more well informed, did your soul leap up and shout, "Very true, Mr. Whitman, and we of 2009 know just how true it is"? I actually did not excerpt Whitman's principal argument against Carlyle. It is 2 pages of windy Hegelism, plainly free of content. Give it a go and see what you think. And he has the link to the Google Books excerpt where he talks about him. So you can go read that if you'd like. Whitman also was a sucker for the mystical and a hippie in the wrong century. He was not alone in this. And he links to the Brook Farm Institute of Agriculture and Education, which was a utopian experiment in communal living in the United States in the 1840s, founded by former Unitarian minister George Ripley and his wife Sophia Ripley at the Ellis Farm in West Roxbury, Massachusetts. It was inspired in part by the ideals of transcendentalism, a religious and cultural philosophy based in New England. Founded as a joint stock company, it promised its participants a portion of the profits from the farm in exchange for performing an equal share of the work. They believed that by sharing the workload, ample time would be available for leisure activities and intellectual pursuits. So he says Whitman was a hippie in the wrong century, and he was not alone because these people were hippies too. But he was an honest man, not afraid to tell us what a fetid gas bag much of modern radicalism is. The good old curate's egg, but still, say more, Mr. Whitman. Alas, men have declined, and poets too. And when Whitman writes, quote, Carlyle's grim fate was cast to live and dwell in and largely embody the parturition agony and qualms of the old order, amid crowded accumulations of ghastly morbidity giving birth to the new. But conceive of him, or his parents before him, coming to America, recuperated by the cheering realities and activity of our people and country, growing up and delving face to face, resolutely among us here, especially at the West, inhaling and exhaling our limitless air and eligibilities, devoting his mind to the theories and developments of this republic amid its practical facts, as exemplified in Kansas, Missouri, Illinois, Tennessee, or Louisiana. I say facts and face-to-face confrontings, so different from books and all those quiddities and mere reports in the libraries, upon which the man, it was wittily said of him at the age of 30 that there was no one in Scotland who had gleaned so much and seen so little, almost wholly fed, in which even his sturdy and vital mind but reflected at best. End quote. Carlyle, of course, was a historian. Reconstructing other worlds from books was his trade, actual time tourism not being an option. So he couldn't travel around to other worlds, so he had to do it through books. And his pithy little wisecracks about contemporary America are worth more a century and a half later than most present libraries. But, more to the point, I can rather easily imagine Carlyle's response to present-day Kansas, Missouri, Illinois, Tennessee, or, Lord help us, Louisiana. If those states in 1881 might have shaken Carlyle's faith in the downward course of democracy, a point on which we may defer to Whitman, I can't imagine their present successors would achieve any such result. In fact, if we could organize a joint tour of their ghosts, I rather imagine that Whitman himself would end up siding with Carlyle on many, if not all, points. We have seen Whitman's honesty, and we cannot imagine him arguing for the track record of democracy since he wrote, if only because all his arguments are plainly falsified. If Carlyle ignores these arguments, he ignores them because they are, and thus must always have been, worthy of nothing but ignorance. Our society, of course, has its own mental defenses against the Carlylean position. There is certainly no shortage of arguments for republicanism and democracy. They are just all different from Whitman's arguments. Still, there are enough that most intelligent people consider the case overwhelming, to the point where they have never seriously considered it. However, if we imagine Whitman dropping his own falsified arguments and picking up the latest and greatest replacements, we imagine a Walt Whitman who is not a poet, but a defense lawyer. People have called Whitman many nasty names, but no one to my knowledge ever described him as a reptilian two-tongued bureaucrat. This does not tell us that there exist no correct arguments for republicanism and democracy against Carlyle and reaction. It merely implies that if Whitman and Carlyle both had a chance to inspect the world of 2009, it is probably Whitman and not Carlyle who would feel chastened and have to apologize. Whitman who would agree with Carlyle, not vice versa. But Whitman and Carlyle could both be wrong, of course. Therefore, we achieve a strange conclusion in our perspective of Carlyle. We begin to suspect that we should at least consider Froude's second alternative, again quoting from Froude. If, on the other hand, Carlyle has been right, If, like his great predecessors, he has read truly the tendencies of this modern age of ours, and his teaching is authenticated by facts, then Carlyle too will take his place among the inspired seers. But if Froude is right, we have only seen half the prophecy unfold. The teaching has been authenticated. The teacher remains unknown. This, dear reader, is why Carlyle matters. For is this not what Froude should have expected? If democracy triumph, and it has, why should it bother to recall its enemy, Carlyle? Does it run out of friends of Whitman's to celebrate? Is it thus forced to sing the praises of its foes? What winner was ever short of friends? Ah, if only victory implied righteousness and might made right. But there is no principle of which the Democrat is more skeptical. The case of democracy is a case in which the jury has heard only from the defense. Year after year, generation after generation, democracy's lawyers trot out an ever-changing dog's breakfast of alibis, character witnesses, and Harvard scientists, all singing one tune: the ironclad innocence and stellar nobility of the defendant, who is no more and no less than Gotham's finest citizen. As for the prosecutor, his corpse has been rotting in the men's room for years. Sometimes the bailiff, who has a ninth-grade education, a Tennessee accent, and a drinking problem, picks up a few pages from his brief and reads them out of order. But is the trial over? It is all but over. The jury is utterly sold. They could adjourn and assign the defendant the keys to Gotham for life, they would. Let me read that again. But is the trial over? It is all but over. The jury is utterly sold. If they could adjourn and assign the defendant the keys to Gotham for life, they would. They are not even aware that there is a trial. What he's saying is people aren't even aware that democracy is still on trial. They just assume that democracy has won and there's nothing to question about it anymore. They think they're deciding whether to award a gold medal or a platinum one. But alas, the verdict of history is never, ever in. Once it does find the truth, though, it tends to stay there. For it is a terrible thing to see a prophecy come true, but more terrible to see just the first half. Time remains for the rest and always will. It is never too late to read Carlyle. It has certainly never been easier. And when he takes his place, etc., I promise you, other things will change. But what exactly is, I claim, authenticated? What did Carlyle believe? What did he foresee? And how does history validate it? And what did he get wrong? For he was not actually a god, of course. It is time to say goodbye to our Whitmans and see the infernal regions for themselves. Okay, this is where it starts getting really good. We've kind of waded through the first little bit there, and here's where things start to take off. Now, just to be clear, my goal is to retain this YouTube channel for longer and be able to do more of these. And there's going to be certain phrases in here that I may need to edit a little bit so that you get the point of what he's saying, but I don't use certain phrases, the type that would be highlighted and targeted by an algorithm. So I just want to make that clear. If I feel like I'm dancing around stuff a few times, I'm dancing around stuff. And we'll be doing it even more in Chapter 3. Okay. Carlyle did not believe in democracy, but he must have believed in something. What then was this something? If you stop believing in democracy, quite a difficult mental step for anyone to 2009, or 1859 in fact, which is much of what made Carlyle unique, what do you believe in instead? Hopefully you will hear a terrible creaking noise as your brain stretches to regard the awful answer. It is not my answer, it is Carlyle's, but I take the liberty of translating. First and foremost, Carlyle is a believer in order. To Carlyle, the old order is not giving birth to the new. It is rotting slowly into anarchy, or burning fast, as in France or later Russia. The destination is not an order at all, but a blackened waste with clumps of singed ferns. Nor does this observation make the old order good. The Ancien regime was termite bait in a fire trap. But in Carlyle's mirror, the pattern that the ordinary Whig historian and his ordinary student know as steady progress punctuated by brilliant revolutions becomes a pattern of an inexorable decay punctuated by explosions of barbarism. And with Whig historian, he linked to Whig history, which is this is a term that there's two terms that I really want people to take away from this episode. One is war is politics. The other is Whig history. Study and look up Whig history. Understand what Whig history is. This is the core of the fallacy of the modern left. And
Isn't it amazing how, like, when you kind of look, when you sort of look at you look at like the origins of the American Revolution in a different way, how it just makes way more sense immediately.
yes,
And then
100%.
therefore, like, the rest of the country, the history
Right.
of the rest of the country kind of makes sense too. I was thinking about that as I was like driving today in anticipation of this, and I was just, if I okay, so all right, how did the American Revolution start? And if it was like, forget that's the American Revolution, and like forget listening to like conservative talk radio ever, or like if you just described a country and just politically, on the political compass, or why can't I think of the word for it? Like a one-dimensional.
The
Continue, like, what's the name?
axis?
I totally can't.
Axis.
Yeah. So right. So I used to be an engineer. Okay, so but like if you describe that and say, okay, where do these tactics fall? Where they're successful, on the political axis. What does it sound like? Immediately, if you've experienced of life in the country, you have an answer, but it's the opposite of what sort of you were taught / what the right has sort of like latched onto.
Mm-hmm.
But then when you look at it in this new way, it just makes so much more sense.
Right.
And then therefore everything that has happened since then makes more sense.
And then you understand. This is when you start to understand that time isn't linear. Time is cyclical. You get the same thing happening over and over and over again. That's because there's a duality to things. You get this chaos order, good, evil, left, right, male, female. This duality exists. And so when you have a duality, it creates cycles as you ping pong back and forth between these dynamics. So one thing that Moldbug, to give a little spoiler, one thing that Moldbug asserts and defends very well is that we have this idea. There's the three major revolutions, which were the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the Russian Revolution. And the general perception, because this is our founding myth, the general perception of these is that the American Revolution was a bunch of conservative, like conservative, freedom-oriented, like libertarians was basically what they were, and that this was like a noble, like right-wing freedom thing, and that the other two, the Russian Revolution and the French Revolution, were both deranged, violent, leftist psychopaths that were just acting completely bizarrely and like didn't have a legitimate case, or just were had one little bit of truth, but then were all wrong with everything else, and then it was all bad and all that. And Moldbug says no, all three of them are that. The American Revolution was just as leftist and deranged and unhinged as the other two. It's just that we're descended from that one, and it's our founding document, so it's been deified in the same way that the North Koreans have their great leader and the great leader Kim Il-sung, and everything. They have this mythos that's been created around him and around the founding of their country. Americans have the exact same thing. We're just as like religiously indoctrinated in the deified history of America as North Koreans are for North Korea. So Moldbug makes that case, and that's a controversial take, and a lot of conservatives and libertarians even they have a really hard time imagining the founders of America being in the same category as, for example, the Russian Revolution or the French Revolution. They don't want to think about things that way, but that's your ideological inheritance. The modern woke crowd is serving a similar dynamic in our society as the American revolutionaries did in society back then. That's a subject for another live reading. But for Whig history, just for those who don't know, it's an approach to historiography that presents the past as an inevitable progression towards ever greater liberty and enlightenment, culminating in modern forms of liberal democracy and constitutional monarchy. In general, Whig historians emphasize the rise of constitutional government, personal freedoms, and scientific progress. The term is often applied generally and pejoratively to histories that present the past as an inexorable march of progress towards enlightenment. The term is also used extensively in the history of science to refer to historiography that focuses on the successful chains of theories and experiments that led to present-day theories while ignoring failed theories and dead ends. Whig history laid the groundwork for modernization theory and the resulting deployment of development aid around the world after World War II, which has sometimes been criticized as destructive to its recipients. So the Whig history is this notion of linear time and that everything's getting better all the time and that we're getting freer and freer. And it's this idea of that modernity has a positive connotation. That's a product of Whig historiography. Modern to us, we hear modern, progress. These words are very loaded with positive connotations. And that's Whig history, is seeing it because it's new, because it's progress, because it's modern. All of this stuff is just by its own nature a good thing. And the reactionary, the neo-reactionary, the royalist, all these if you're king-pilled, you'll recognize that that's not the case. You'll recognize that there's aspects in which that's the case, but also progress is entropic, it's chaotic, and it's by definition not inherently good. Back to Moldbug. Okay, so I'm going to reread this paragraph here just so that we get back into the swing of what he's talking about. So first and foremost, Carlyle is a believer in order. To Carlyle, the old order is not giving birth to the new; it is rotting slowly into anarchy, or burning fast, as in France or later Russia. The destination is not an order at all, but a blackened waste with clumps of singed ferns. Nor does this observation make the old order good. Like, just because things are moving from good to bad doesn't mean things aren't moving from bad to worse. That can be the same thing. So just because he's saying things are worse now doesn't mean they were good before. It just means that they're worse now. The ancient regime, or the ancient regime, was termite bait and a fire trap. But in Carlyle's mirror, the pattern that was the ordinary Whig historian and his ordinary student know as steady progress punctuated by brilliant revolution becomes instead a pattern of inexorable decay punctuated by explosions of barbarism. Here is a characteristic passage often quoted on this blog from Shooting Niagara, Carlyle's last great reactionary pamphlet. It cannot be quoted too often. Now, a fair warning, Carlyle is he has a unique writing style. It's definitely a product of 18th, 19th century thought. So just kind of bear with it as I read this. I'll try to make it as clear as I can. All the millenniums I ever heard of heretofore were to be preceded by a chaining of the devil for 1,000 years, laying him up, tied neck and heels, and put beyond stirring as the preliminary. You two have been taking preliminary steps with more and more ardor for 30 years back, but they seem to be all in the opposite direction. A cutting asunder of straps and ties wherever you might find them, pretty indiscriminate of choice in the matter, a general repeal of old regulations, fetters, and restrictions. Restrictions on the devil originally, I believe, for most part, but now fallen slack and ineffectual, which had become unpleasant to many of you, with loud shouting from the multitude as strap after strap was cut. Glory, glory, another strap is gone. He's describing the straps that bound the devil prior to the millennium, speaking in like Revelation from the Bible talks about the devil and the bottomless pit and being chained for 1,000 years, etc. So what he's describing is that what's actually happening is the devil is being gradually unchained, and each strap is being hacked away, and everyone's cheering and exulting in it. This, I think, has mainly been the sublime legislative industry of Parliament since it became Reform Parliament, victoriously successful and thought sublime and beneficent by some, so that now hardly any limb of the devil has a thrum or tatter of rope or leather left upon it. There needs almost superhuman heroism in you to whip a garroter. No Fenian taken with the reddest hand is to be meddled with under penalties. Hardly a murderer, never so detestable and hideous, but you find him insane and board him at the public expense, a very peculiar British prytaneum of these days. And, in fact, the devil, he, verily, if you will consider the sense of words, is likewise become an emancipated gentleman, lithe of limb as in Adam and Eve's time, and scarcely a toe or finger of him tied any more. And you, my astonishing friends, you are certainly getting into a millennium such as never was before, hardly even in the dreams of Bedlam. to interpret kind of what he's saying there basically is that he's describing the modern justice system, and that to use some type of corporal punishment against even like a murderer or an assassin. Nobody even wants to do that. You'll take a murderer, so hardly a murderer, never so detestable and hideous, but you find him insane and board him at the public expense. So you imprison him instead of like killing him or whipping him or whatever. You put him in prison and you just lock him in there, and then everybody else has to pay for it. And he's like, this is deranged. How do you consider this progress? This is completely insane. And so basically he's saying this is the devil's work, and the devil is being allowed to roam free. And in fact, is not even being recognized as the devil, but is being treated as what he called him, an emancipated gentleman. And so he's predicting that this is going to get us to a millennium, and not the millennium everyone else is thinking. It's going to be a millennium of bedlam. Back to Moldbug. We speak of prophecy. Well, what became of Britain in this century of democracy, this millennium, in which the devil became an emancipated gentleman? Britain lost her empire in most of Ireland and became a political satellite of America. Her industries declined and largely disappeared. Her crime rate rose by a factor of 50. Not 50%, a factor of 50. Her aristocracy was decimated by 2 continental wars of unparalleled savagery and permanently destroyed by punitive taxation, which he links to the People's Budget, which was a proposal of the Liberal government in 1909 and 1910 that introduced unprecedented taxes on the lands and incomes of Britain's wealthy to fund new social welfare programs. Many areas of London and other cities became unsafe by day and more by night. Her lower classes, generally augmented by the dregs of the late empire, achieved levels of squalor, ignorance, and degradation perhaps unsurpassed in human history. And he links to the book Life at the Bottom, The Worldview That Makes the Underclass by Theodore Dalrymple. Meanwhile, the Crown and the Lords disappeared as meaningful political entities, the Commons ceased to be a genuine forum for debate and became a parking lot for party hacks, and political power diffused into a vast, shapeless morass of Whitehall bureaucrats, Berlaymont bureaucrats, mendacious talking heads, and professors of incompetence. And worst of all, most appalling of all, Britons do not feel they have a problem. Quite the contrary. They have never been better governed. The smarter and more informed they are, the more deeply they thank the 20th century from saving them from the evils of the Victorian age. The educated Englishman of 2009 considers himself the beneficiary of 2 centuries of steadily improving good government from Castlereagh to Gordon Brown. Indeed, if any faint shadow of anything like a Carlylean view persists anywhere as a living tradition, it's in America herself. Evaluated as pure reaction, American conservatism is the most confused, polluted, and diluted sample conceivable, but so long as we exclude elderly Chilean generals, it is by far the most reactionary thing on earth. Elderly Chilean generals being Pinochet. There is nothing remotely like a European equivalent. In Europe, especially the continent, all is left. And that's a capital L, left. In Europe, especially the continent, all is left. Yet Whitman wrote, quote, I have deliberately repeated it all, not only an offset to Carlyle's ever-looking pessimism and world decadence, but as presenting the most thoroughly American points of view I know. In my opinion, the above formulas of Hegel are an essential and crowning justification of New World democracy in the creative realms of time and space. There is that about them which only the vastness, the multiplicity, and the vitality of America would seem able to comprehend, to give scope and illustration to, or to be fit for, or even originate. It is strange to me that they were born in Germany, or in the Old World at all. While a Carlyle, I should say, is quite the legitimate European product to be expected. End quote. In 2009, of course, warmed over Walt Whitman is all we get from Europe. Britain, with a few exceptions, the continent without. The few exceptions being Peter Hitchens, is who he linked to as the few exceptions in Britain. The legitimate European product is not reaction, but socialism. Not Carlyle, but Pinter. Not Metternich, but Cohn-Bendit. Ah, if only might proved right. If only. We could all take another blue pill and sleep with such sweet smiles. Here we start to see the prophetic powers of Carlyle. 150 years ago, it was imaginable that American republicanism and democracy would eventually triumph, but certainly not that it would eradicate every independent trace of indigenous continental or even British thought. Carlyle does not even quite predict this, but if anyone could have imagined it, it was him. Compare the great reactionary to a mere conservative of his time, if no mean one, Queen Victoria herself. Victoria, if you read her letters, which are well worth reading, emerges as no cipher either political or intellectual, and her view of the disturbances of 1848, which is the revolutions of 1848, known in some countries as the springtime of the peoples or the springtime of nations, which was a series of political upheavals throughout Europe in 1848. It remains the most widespread revolutionary wave in European history. Her view of the disturbances of 1848 is much the same as Carlyle's. And yet, in 1851, she writes to Leopold I of Belgium, quote, "The position of princes is no doubt difficult in these times, but it would be much less so if they would behave honorably and straightforwardly, giving the people gradually those privileges which would satisfy all the reasonable and well-intentioned, and would weaken the power of the Red Republicans. Instead of that, reaction and a return to all the tyranny and oppression is the cry and the principle, and all papers and books are being seized and prohibited, as in the days of Metternich." Close quote. In other words, Victoria believes the cure for acute democracy is chronic democracy. Canning and Palmerston have spent the entire post-Napoleonic era going about Europe fighting Metternich and all other defenders of the old European order, promoting British clients, such as Piedmont, under the banner of constitutional monarchy, which Victoria and many like her consider the cure for red republicanism. Yes, Virginia, our own dear Republicans originated as the most left-wing party in the most left-wing country on earth. The name is not at all a coincidence. They were basically socialists. They adored ethnic minorities, and if their party had a color, it was red. How things change. So the Red Republicans were, they emerged as basically a radical socialist revolt in the mid-1850s because they, as Republicans, they were related to a monarchy, a constitutional monarchy. So from a constitutional monarchy to a republic, you're getting a decentralized effect. So the people who were advocating for the republic were psychologically, cognitively the leftists and like the socialists of the day. They basically had socialist policies they wanted to implement through a republic. So they wanted to replace the constitutional monarchy with a republic. That's how Republicans initiated. Now Republicans are red, but traditionally red was the color of communism. It was the color of decentralization, the color of socialism. He also links where he says, "Yes, Virginia." He just linked to "Yes, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus," which is a line from an editorial called "Is There a Santa Claus?" It appeared in the September 21, 1897 edition of the New York Sun and has since become part of a popular Christmas folklore in the United States. It's the most reprinted newspaper editorial in the English language. I have never heard of that. "Yes, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus." I don't know why someone would have heard of that, but he has, and so he references it just offhand when he says, "Yes, Virginia." Now, curiously, today, everyone agrees that there is no such thing as constitutional monarchy. Constitutional monarchy in 2009 is a synonym for symbolic monarchy, which is vestigial monarchy, if at all, quite indistinguishable in reality from any red republicanism. Queen Victoria was not at all without actual power. Queen Elizabeth is. This outcome would not have surprised Carlyle, nor might it have surprised Whitman, to whom all queens were dinosaurs. It would certainly have surprised everyone in between. Thus, the exercise of hindsight devastates the entire political center, liberal, moderate, and conservative. Validation is available only to the reactionary and the radical, 19th century, or progressive, 20th century, both of whom hold the only consistent position. The true spirit of democracy is anarchy, dissolution of hierarchical authority. To the radical, this flame, if not snuffed out, cannot be withstood. To the reactionary, the cancer will either kill the patient or be eradicated. To both, no stable compromise is possible or desirable. So he's comparing democracy to cancer. How will the center of 2009 hold up in the light of 2159? It is a different center, of course, but this is hardly a promise of durability. Consider how you will react if the center of 2009 turns out to be the right of the center of 2029, following the general pattern of human history, which is imagine a right-wing position in 2009 and what the common right-wing positions were then. Even a left-wing position then could be considered right-wing today. That's how fast things are moving to the left. So he's saying, imagine 2029. Consider the 20th century's favorite centrist tract, The Vital Center, written in 1949 by its favorite court historian, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., a young crony of FDR and old crony of JFK. Then consider Professor Schlesinger's last work, The Disuniting of America, Reflections on a Multicultural Society, in 1991. You can read these books, but do you need to? Escaping this trap of centrism is the first and most difficult task for those tempted to think outside the democratic box. Faced with the endless, mind-boggling whirl of mass political mania, the assumption that there exists some Goldilocks mean, not too hot or too cold, which just happens to correspond to the average public opinion of the current generation, which is absurdly left-wing in the eyes of the previous generation, and will be absurdly right-wing in the eyes of the next, and which therefore should be correct, or at least a starting point. Alas, the more we focus our eyes on it, the more this island of seeming sanity melts and disappears. So just in case that got bogged down in too many words, centrism, there's this idea that centrism is just like, it's like the average person will all kind of coalesce around something that's obviously the truth and it's the most reasonable, and that just will naturally work out. So centrism, being a centrist, that seems like we kind of balance the two sides out. And meanwhile, a centrist of 2021 is far to the left of a centrist of 2009, which is far to the left of a centrist of 1959, and so on. Centrism keeps moving very, very rapidly to the left. We find ourselves in the middle of the ocean. We suddenly realize that we know nothing at all about human politics. We are forced not just to consider the set of theories of government which are popular now, but the set which has ever been popular. Most have applied their minds only to two theories of republicanism, the liberal and conservative as practiced today, between which there is almost no distance by historical standards. And then we abandon our centrism and we are comforted. We read Carlyle and we see that there were only two logically consistent choices for our political belief. They can be briefly summarized as Carlyle and Alinsky. What we see instead, from both the Carlylean and Alinskyist perspectives, is a monotonic slope. This is the slope of order. Order slopes up to the right. True right, which is reactionary, is always the direction of increasing order. And true left, the direction of increasing disorder. It is especially valuable to have a clear definition of this polarization, which seems to have evolved independently so many times in history. David Axelrod would surely get along with the Gracchi, and Pinochet with Sola. Since most people do not know the Carlylean theory of order, but most do know the Alinskyist theory of disorder, I won't be surprised if my daughter is introduced to activism well before kindergarten, there is an obvious temptation here. The temptation is to derive the Carlylean theory by simply reversing its equally uncompromising Alinskyist dual. Thus, everything bad is good, and so on. For example, from this perspective, we could reach the absurd conclusion that the ultimate act of good government is to shoot into a mob. While this approach can be useful in an absolute emergency, I would encourage readers to at least be very careful with it. The practice of defining the right by reversing the left can lead one to idolize persons and practices who, in the true Carlylean cosmos, are quite unworthy. It is definitely not for the apprentice necromancer or candidate Sith Lord. So basically, there's this instinct that people, right-wingers will easily, conservatives will easily understand Alinskyism. So then they'll say, okay, well, if Alinskyism is bad, then we just do the opposite of all of that and we get good. And he's saying that doesn't work. It doesn't fly that way, because you still, if you're trying to reach the point of Carlyle, you're not going to do that just by doing the opposite of Alinsky. It's a completely different thing going on here.
Yeah, and we've lived through watching how the rules do not apply the same way in very recent history. And that's also part, if you take it back to like the myth of the American Revolution, that gives a lot of people with more maybe right sensibilities the idea that, oh, it was successful in the past for us, and it wasn't.
Right. Because that wasn't you.
The Whig history wasn't you.
Right. If you were the right wing person of that age, you would have been a Tory. The people on the side of the American Revolution were leftists of their day, and they had the same energy, broadly speaking. So there's this thing then that right-wingers always want to say, they want to like, okay, we'll take the leftist tactics and use it against them. The problem with that is that leftist tactics are designed to create chaos. They're designed to create disorder, because leftism is chaotic. Leftism is disorder. So if you try to use their tactics against them, you're just feeding into their own reality. You're creating the world that they want. So it just accelerates them, and it moves them even further along their path, which is toward gaining power. So using left-wing tactics against the left is a good way to give power to the left. Indeed, the Carlylean theory of order might just as well be stated as truth or justice. For Carlyle, truth, justice, and order are all inseparable and perfectly desirable. There is no such thing as too much truth, too much justice, or too much order. The ideal society is one in which all these qualities are seen to their maximum extent. In the society that is cosmos, truth, justice, and order all pertain. In its opposite, chaos, we see lies and injustice and disorder. Indeed, Carlyle is often described as not just a prophet, but a theologian. And indeed, there are 92 references to the word God in the keystone of his political work, the Latter-day Pamphlets. You may not believe in God, I don't, but until you understand Carlyle's theology, you cannot understand his theory of government. Carlyle was raised a true Scottish Calvinist, an obsolete form of Christianity which actually believed in the concept of sin. And if you have some kind of rational allergy to Christianity, you will never be able to read his books. Sorry. Order, in Carlyle, is obedience to the law of God in government, and enforcement of the law of God is the test of good government. And what is the law of God? Does it have anything to do with mixed fibers, which he links to the Leviticus 19:19, which says, "You shall not wear a garment of cloth made of two kinds of material." There's actually, if you go search out, I don't remember the exact explanation, but just as a interesting bit of trivia, go search out the reason for that. There was a very good reason for why that was encouraged. I can't remember who I heard talking about it, but it was very fascinating. It might have been Jonathan Pajot who said something about why that was telling people not to mix different kinds of materials. There was actually a really good socio-cultural reason for that. So people laugh at it now, but it actually was a legitimate thing at that point. So Moldbug says, what is the law of God? Does it have anything to do with mixed fibers? It does not. It is no more than truth, justice, and order, each of which reduces to the other. While these buzzwords are easy to say, justice is a buzzword of the present regime, and truth is not far behind. Order has escaped the owl droppings, however, unless you live in Brazil, the flag of Brazil is the green and yellow, or less usually Aura Verde, the gold green. It's a blue disc depicting a starry sky, which includes the Southern Cross, spanned by a curved band inscribed with the national motto, Ordem e Progresso, Order and Progress. So they officially adopted this design for the national flag in 1889, and that's very interesting. So Order and Progress is on the flag of Brazil. So he said, he's writing in 2009 talking about the Obama regime. He said, while these buzzwords are easy to say, justice is a buzzword of the present regime and truth is not far behind. Order has escaped the owl droppings, however, unless you live in Brazil. Thus it remains the best word with which to describe Carlylean thought. Let us work up from order to Carlyle's theory of slavery. If you can understand slavery through Carlyle's eyes, and he is one of the few theoretical defenders of slavery in the last 2 centuries, the only other I can think of offhand being George Fitzhugh, nothing in Carlyle will shock you. So if you can understand slavery through Carlyle's eyes, then nothing else that he writes will shock you. For once, I will paraphrase, because Carlyle's essay on the subject, The Occasional Discourse, should not be the first Carlyle you read, but the last. A good political education in Carlyle is, first, Chartism, then the Latter-day Pamphlets, then Shooting Niagara, then The Occasional Discourse. I would hate to spoil this progression. So again, I will not quote Carlyle on slavery. Order, for Carlyle, is the set of bonds between the humans in society. A bond is any promise of importance. It may be a promise of payment, it may be a promise of work, it may be a promise of marriage. Regardless, a society is orderly if it is a society in which promises of significant human value, explicit or implicit, are made and kept. Every promise is an obligation. By writing the promise, I compel my future self. If I promise to pay you $1,000 in 2011, I'm not exercising my human right of liberty if, in 2011, I refuse to pay you. I cannot say, nah, man, I'd rather be free. By not paying you, man, I'm exercising my human right to be free. Consider the difference between the society in which I can get away with this hippie shit and the society in which I can't. The society in which obligations can be broken is the society in which loans are either risky, expensive, and hard to get, or do not exist at all. Thus, we see clearly that the society in which promises are made and kept, the society of order, is more civilized and humane. It is a better society. Once again, there is no Goldilocks effect, no golden mean. We thus see that the enforcement of promises is a critical aspect of human society. So it's interesting. I was thinking about this as I was reading it before we went live earlier, and I was thinking that through promises, we create the future. If we make promises and then we abide by those promises, it enables everybody else to predict the future, to prophesy in effect. Because once you have a group of people who have all promised, they said, I will do XYZ by XYZ date, and then they actually do that, someone who expected them to do that was someone who predicted the future. So through promises and through binding ourselves and being faithful to our promises, as people do that all throughout a society, you now are instead of the future being chaotic and unpredictable, the future is predictable. You know what's going to happen. You've created order. We thus see that the enforcement of promises is a critical aspect of human society. Certain promises are self-enforcing. They are fulfilled because the promiser wants to fulfill them. Marriage, in the ideal, is such a promise. In most cases, however, a loan is not. A society that contains an impartial and irresistible enforcer of contracts is thus preferable to one which does not, although no contract with the enforcer itself can be enforced by definition. So if you have the choice between a society where contracts are not enforced and a society where they are always enforced 100% of the time no matter what, you would choose the latter. You would want the society where contracts are always enforced 100%. It's always dependable. If you make any contract with someone else, it will always be enforced. This is part of what people are trying to do with like smart contracts with Ethereum and stuff, is they're trying to create a circumstance where every contract somebody participates in is enforced and is fulfilled exactly the way it was intended. Once you've done that, you've created peace effectively, because now everybody their behavior is constrained by the contracts that they've made. And anybody who won't make a contract gets flushed out of society and doesn't get to participate because you can't trust them. So the problem that you run into, though, is that the society, the enforcer, the absolute enforcer, cannot enforce upon itself by definition. You need another enforcer. You need a higher enforcer. So that this is kind of like the loophole. This is the outlet through which energy escapes from this system, and that we can't keep the system closed off and everything contained. So far, the enterprising libertarian will go with you, although he will certainly quibble at the last that no contract with the enforcer itself can be enforced by definition. A society is richer if each individual in it has the right to bind her future actions by agreed obligations, in return for which others may exchange other consideration. Would this bother Ayn Rand? I'm afraid I've never read Ayn Rand. I know. It's terrible. I should. It would certainly bother Rothbard, but sometimes this is a virtue. Once we get this far, we are almost all the way to Carlyle on slavery. We have not agreed that a man can be born a slave, but we agree that he can sell himself into slavery. That is, he can sign a contract with a master in which the slave agrees unconditionally to obey and work for the master, and the master agrees unconditionally to protect and support the slave. Moreover, this contract need not be a mere expression of sentiment. It can and should be enforced by the state, just as a loan is. If the slave changes his mind and runs away, the state will capture and return him, billing the master for the expense. Or, at least, these are reasonable terms under which two parties might agree on the permanent relationship of master and slave. Such terms could also be agreed on a non-permanent basis, yielding the relationship of indentured servitude, familiar to all American high school students. The laws of early America and England were indeed both more flexible and more orderly than our own in permitting and enforcing this form of order. The relationship of flexibility to order and sclerosis to disorder is a common one in Carlylean analysis. So there's this idea that I was just talking about this on Twitter with Popular Liberty the last couple of days. There's this notion that order is static, that order is something that doesn't change, that order is something that's set in space, and that chaos is flexibility and adaptability. And that's the exact opposite. The exact opposite is true. Chaos is a static state. Chaos is a state without order. It is static. Order, by definition, is growth. It's adaptability. It's evolution. It's a process. It's a systematic process by which you derive order from chaos. If something is static, If something is in a state of a state of stasis, then it's sclerotic. That's disorder. That's chaos. For there to be growth, there must be some form of order. So evolution and adaptability, fitness, all of these things are all forms of order. These are all manifestations or expressions of order. So this idea that, we need to have a balance between the right and the left because the right is it's frozen and locked in place and it doesn't change at all, and so we need to have a little bit of chaos in there to change things up. That's just a misapprehension of what chaos and order are, the definitions of these terms. So one thing that Carlyle points out here is that order necessarily has to be flexible. It has to adapt. It has to grow. It has to be alive. If it's not growing, if it's not adapting, if it's not evolving, it's not true order. You've built a system that isn't orderly. It's ultimately chaotic in some sense, and it'll collapse and fall apart back into a state of disorder. So now you have to build a new system that resolves that point of non-adaptability and becomes adaptive and begins to work. Because if your truth, if your lower T truth is not adaptive, if it doesn't work, it's not truth. It's not capital T truth. Capital T truth is fit. It is fitness. It is adaptive by definition. The thing that works is true by definition. If it doesn't work, it's not true. So if it's not adaptive, it's not the truth, capital T truth. So the laws of early America and England were indeed both more flexible and more orderly than our own in permitting and enforcing this form of order, this type of enforced contract like indentured servitude. This still does not get us to classic Anglo-American slavery in the Southern or West Indian style, or of course the classic Greek or Roman forms. Most human societies, and in particular most civilized societies, have had some form of slavery or bondage. And typically this is involuntary slavery, not at all the nice libertarian type. To despise these societies as a class is an anthropological solecism. And solecism is a word that I've been becoming familiar with more recently, which is a grammatical mistake in speech or writing. It's like a faux pas, or it's something that it transgresses the rules of its own system. So to despise these ancient societies is a class in anthropological solecism because our society is built upon them. We're derived from them. So if we act like there's something completely separate from us, then we're like shooting our own ancestors, kind of. Those who consider slave societies intrinsically evil, a word the 20th century would be well advised to keep well away from its tongue, would quickly change their tunes if forced, like this man, to function in an actual slave society. And this man he links to a Google book, A South Side View of Slavery, or 3 Months at the South in 1854, written by Nehemiah Adams. So that's a book you can go read if you'd like. He has the Google book link here. We are all Horatios. This world is not in our philosophy. When we judge it without seeing it or knowing anything about it, we only reveal ourselves as fools. So in other words, these ancient societies that had slaves in them, we think, well, they were just backwards, terrible societies because they had slavery, and we're so much better because we don't have slavery. He's like, not so fast. You might want to read and study them a little bit more because they had slavery, but they also had stuff that we don't have, and we have vastly more evil things in our society than they did. The 20th century was the most murderous century in human history. Those ones, even like on a percentage basis, those ancient societies, they may have had things that our modern sentiment is like repulsed by, but we should understand why they did things the way they did because there was a reason, and it worked for them in a degree that certain things aren't working for us. It is only a short step from seeing the state as an enforcer of voluntary and binding obligations to an enforcer of involuntary and arbitrary obligations. No society can possibly exist without uncontracted obligations. So there's this idea that we can build in a society where everything is all based on voluntary contract. And what he's saying is that that's not possible because by definition, a society has to have uncontractable obligations, obligations that are simply arbitrary, just a product of it. And he's going to explain why that is. For example, property and in particular real estate, represent a class of obligations behind which there is no principle but historical accident. I am obliged not to trespass on your land. I did not agree not to trespass on your land, but I am obliged nonetheless. And why is it your land rather than my land? Because it is. Everyone is born into a web of involuntary obligations. The family. No one gets to pick their parents. Moreover, every family is part of a human society and thus accepts the obligations of that society. You do not need to go to Carlyle for an explanation of the relationship between slavery, family, and community, for you can find it in Aristotle. Indeed, the definition of family in most times and places has included slaves. In Aristotle, the relationship of master and slave is a natural human relationship, that of patron and client. Like true familial relationships, these essentially feudal structures are bidirectional. The client must obey and serve the patron. The patron must care for and protect the client. On one side of the relationship is always authority. On the other side, always dependency. Either side may violate its obligations, resulting in state intervention. In the most ordered and flexible feudal societies, the relationship of patron and client becomes a true governance relationship. I want to circle back to something here real quick. He said either side may violate its obligations, resulting in state intervention. So the typical libertarian mind recoils from that. State intervention, oh, I can't have that. And so you naturally start thinking, oh, these can just enforce themselves. We don't need another third party there that's enforcing these for people. But what you're advocating for then is might makes right. You're advocating for the tyranny of the most powerful. That's what it is. When you say these things should just emerge, should just be emergent, they should just evolve it voluntarily, and we should take the voluntary arrangements. The definition of that, the actual working out of that in real life, in practice, in meat space, is the most powerful wins. Because then, if there isn't a third party that's obligated to step in and enforce these obligations between the authority and or the patron and the client, between the authority and the dependent, if there isn't a third party doing that, then the authority is going to enforce it every time until at whatever point the client figures out a way to overpower him. This is how you're when you say that you want everything to just be emergent and voluntary, what you're saying is you want might makes right, but you want it to just evolve voluntarily and it be whoever happens to become the most powerful. That's Ancapistan. That's the libertarian ideal that they haven't thought about, because they think of human beings as blank slates that'll just kind of naturally come into the world, and that they only learn all these things. And if we could just keep them from learning all these things, then everyone would just naturally interact peacefully. And people don't do that. People don't just naturally interact peacefully because, again, beginning of the show, predation. There will always be people who are naturally predatory. And if they are, when they are naturally predatory, if they enter a system where there isn't an existing structure, well, number one, they don't enter systems without existing structures because they're parasitic. They prey upon other structures. So if your structure is we don't have a structure, then they're going to take advantage of your lack of structure to impose upon you. This is the way that the left will always function in any society that they're ever in. So Ancapistan, the ANCAP ideal, the naturally voluntary emergent thing, what that is in practice is might makes right. So they reject, they kick back against the idea of a state because how do you just believe might makes right? But what you're advocating for is a might makes right system. So, back to Moldbug. In the most ordered and flexible feudal societies, the relationship of patron and client becomes a true governance relationship. The patron is personally responsible for all offenses of the client against society. This is a core tenet of human law, applying both to slaves and children. So if your slave, in Roman law, if your slave violated someone else, that's your responsibility because it was your slave. It's not the slave's responsibility. It's the slave's responsibility and his relationship between you and him, but it's not the slave's responsibility in the relationship between him and the rest of society. In return, the patron holds the power of the magistrate over his clients. In the old days of the Roman Republic, a father could order the execution of his son on his own word alone. This is even a bit extreme for me, but it demonstrates the concept. We see the most palatable relatives of hereditary slavery in the feudal European societies, where we have not had slavery in the antique sense, but serfdom, slavery ad scriptae glebae, or peasants bound to the soil. The 20th century historian will generally describe this system as if it were something like the Gulag, or possibly even Auschwitz, or maybe just the Angola Penitentiary, and everyone was just biding their time and waiting to be free. This is what it is to be an enemy of the past. You are doomed to walk through life lying. Try to imagine yourself visiting 13th century France and recommending the liberation of the serfs. The serfs would have been the people fighting you the most. Think of today and lockdown measures. All these people who are just begging the state to lock them down, just begging someone to put a boot on their throat. That's the exact same psychology. That's serf psychology. That's slave psychology. These are people begging for slavery. They exist in every society. We call them there's people that we say we need a welfare system for people who can't take care of themselves. Every other society has had a welfare system. It was serfdom or slavery. It was like, I will take you into my care. I will provide for you. I'll protect you. I'll give you everything that you need in return for you working for me. That's the relationship of the state to the welfare class today. They say, we'll give you everything that you want, everything that you need in return for you turning your life over to us. And we'll let you pretend to be free. You can claim to be free within the context of us caring for you and providing for you and giving you everything you need. That's what he's going into describing here. Thus, we see the root of democracy's antipathy to slavery, its antipathy to feudalism. These structures are clearly in the same class. Is there a difference between being born bound to a person and born bound to the land? There is, but not much of one. In both cases, you are born to obligations. You did not agree to these obligations, yet they are your inescapable burden. Had the luck of your fresh minted soul been different, you might have been born to privilege instead. And good luck, Carlyle will tell you grimly, in abolishing luck. But wait, when one is born a serf, bound to the land with obligations, one is bound not to a person, but to a political entity. In the case of serfdom, assuming the extremity of personal restriction, this is a small political entity. This may be a problem if you're a restless fellow and like to get around, but seeing Europe was not the primary concern of most pre-industrial agricultural workers. Moreover, regardless of the size or nature of the entity to which you are born bound, allowing you to stretch your legs is no risk at all, so long as that entity has the power to catch you and bring you back. Again, this is true for both serfs and slaves. Suddenly, we see the relationship between slavery and government. Serfdom and slavery can be described as micro-government and nano-government, respectively. In government proper, the normal human role of patron is filled by a giant, impersonal, and often accidentally sadistic bureaucracy, which is sovereign and self-securing. In serfdom, this role is filled by a noble house or other large family business, which in turn is a client of the state and just as fixed to the land as its serfs. In slavery, mastership is exercised by a mobile individual whose slaves go with him. Democracy here appears as simply a mechanism for controlling subjects by deluding them into believing that they control the entire enterprise, a pretense which cannot be maintained in the context of serfdom or slavery. So democracy is just a deceptive form of slavery, in a literal sense. You're taking the slaves and you're telling them, actually, you control everything through your vote. But the relationship hasn't changed. They don't control anything more than they did before. They're still beholden to the institutional powers that govern them, just the same as the slaves or serfs. Slavery is an inescapable feature of humankind. It's not, you cannot get it out of human society. It will always manifest in one way or another because of the nature of human social relationships. I'm having to be careful here now because I'm starting to get into words that are going to cause problems. In fact, I might start saying, let's see, what can I say instead? Let's say shaved ice. I'm going to say shaved ice instead of slavery. Democracy here appears as simply a mechanism for controlling subjects by deluding them into believing that they control the entire enterprise, a pretense which cannot be maintained in the context of serfdom or shaved ice. In this role, it is certainly unnecessary, as physical enforcement technologies are quite sufficient. The mind control state is obsolete. So the mind control state exists so that they don't have to use physical enforcement technologies the way that past shaved ice owners controlled their shaved ice. In all of these relationships, the structure of obligation is the same. The subject, serf, or shaved ice, is obliged to obey the government, lord, or master and work for the benefit of same. In return, the government, lord, or master must care for and guide the subject, serf, or shaved ice. We see these same relationship parameters emerging whether the relationship of domination originates as a hereditary obligation or as a voluntary obligation, or in a state outside law, such as the state of the newly captured prisoner, the traditional origin of shaved ice status in most eras. This is a pretty good clue that this type of bidirectional hierarchical structure is one to which humans are biologically adapted. Not all humans are born the same, of course, and Carlyle, following Aristotle, takes the view that the innate character and intelligence of some is more suited to mastery than shaved ice. For others, it is more suited to shaved ice. And others still are badly suited to either. These characteristics can be expected to group differently in human populations of different origins. Thus, Spaniards and Englishmen in the Americas in the 17th and earlier centuries, whose sense of political correctness was negligible, found that Africans tended to make good shaved ice and Indians did not. The discovery of Charles Darwin, who knew Carlyle personally, suggests that this broad pattern of observation is most parsimoniously explained, at least in part, by biological differences. Indeed, there is no question that biological differences played a role in Europeans' preference for African over Indian shaved ice in at least one respect. Due to superior genetic resistance, Africans were much less likely to die of introduced tropical diseases like yellow fever and malaria. From Carlyle's point of view, a person makes good shaved ice if he is loyal, patient, and not exceptionally bright or stubborn. But even great intelligence is not necessarily a bar to a good experience in shaved ice, as the experience of many Greek shaved ice philosophers, such as Epictetus, shows. A shaved ice must carry the unique burden of personal dependency and obedience, which we are all used to expressing only toward impersonal government agencies. One typically does not experience emotional bonds with, say, the IRS, unless they are bonds of hate. There is nonetheless an emotional bond with Washington as a whole, a sense of being part of the team that is your owner and owner of its other subjects. All psychologically normal subjects, serfs, or shaved ice feel this so long as their government, lord, or master is both sane and competent. Otherwise, any derangement may occur. Of course, the smaller the group, the more intense the feelings, for better or for worse. But in general, the normal case is real affection on both sides. Moreover, just because the relationship of shaved ice or serfdom is personal by default, does not imply that it cannot be made impersonal, like the relationship of subject to government. If the client is not one of Aristotle's natural shaved ice, has an IQ over 90 as an adult and can provide his own personal guidance, the subject-government relationship may be a better fit. The master may maximize his economic benefit by simply allowing the shaved ice to negotiate his own employment and living arrangements and taxing him. Thus, the parallel reemerges. Conversely, the subject-to-government relationship easily becomes dysfunctional for clients who are natural shaved ice, i.e., are not capable of guiding themselves to live in a human and humane manner. It is beyond question that such individuals exist, if only as a result of brain damage. And it is easily seen that they thrive under personal guidance and wilt and grow foul in the arms of bureaucrats. If all long-term welfare cases were transferred from Washington to the authority of genuine and truly charitable nonprofits, for example, their new human supervisors could intervene on a personal discretionary basis to compel them to get their acts together. This would be a step toward humanity in our society, and also a step toward shaved ice. That's a really profound observation, that those who seek to eradicate the institution of shaved ice in all senses of the word they're not eradicating the people who are inclined for it. They tried, they've made a good effort toward that, but those people will always exist. And there has to be a more humanitarian way of taking care of them. They're not able to be sovereign for themselves. They're not able to take care of themselves. And expecting them to pull their own weight and to sign contracts and get themselves involved in all sorts of different situations is just cruel. You're putting them into a position that they just aren't suited to, and they never will be. They need someone to care for them. This is why I tweeted the other day, I said a king, capital K king, rules over his people in the same sense that a father rules over his children. It's not that a father rules over his children, it's that his children are not capable of managing for themselves, of taking care of themselves. So they need to have a ruler who manages them. And maybe at some point they may learn how to manage themselves, in which case they may no longer need a ruler in the same sense. But this is the relationship. A kingly relationship is a patriarchal, it's a fatherly relationship to his subjects, the people who they're the subjects of his care, the people that he's responsible for looking out for and providing for defending, for supporting in whatever way that they need. That's the relationship that is missing. I need more water. Okay. So that's interesting at the end there that he said, if all long-term welfare cases were transferred from Washington to the authority of genuine, truly charitable nonprofits, for example, their new human supervisors could intervene on a personal, discretionary basis to compel them to get their acts together. This would be a step toward humanity in our society and also a step toward shaved ice. Probably the closest most Americans have come to idealizing shaved ice, without, of course, knowing it, is in the good press that large Japanese corporations once got for maintaining a policy of lifetime employment. Lifetime employment and shaved ice are, of course, practically synonyms. And indeed, the same phenomena of reciprocal loyalty and dependency were said, repeatedly in my memory in the 90s on NPR, to emerge, right down to the company uniform and song. This, too, is a Carlylean bond, although a rather weird one to the Western eye. We thus observe the Carlylean and Aristotelian view that shaved ice is a natural human relationship like marriage. Of course, like marriage, shaved ice is not without its abuses. When we think of the word shaved ice, we think of these abuses. Thus, Carlyle would argue, by defining the word as intrinsically abusive, like marriages in which one party beats the other, we conveniently define away all the instances of shaved ice in which the relationship is functional. Carlyle is in fact ready to be as indignant as anyone over these abuses. He reasons, since shaved ice is a natural human relationship, this bond will exist regardless of whether you abolish the word. And it does, if only in broken and surreptitious forms. However, if you are a genuine humanitarian, and your interest is in abolishing the abuses, the best way to do so is to abolish the abuses. So, for example, Carlyle proposes reforms such as stronger supervision of shaved ice owners, a standard price by which shaved ice can buy their freedom, etc., etc. Now again, you're talking about an engineering problem. Which solution works the best to accomplish this problem? Not a moral question. Which solution works the best? You just have to engineer the solution. And the development of technology can facilitate that. But it takes leadership, and it takes people who are willing to be honest and willing to put skin in the game and willing to actually devise these types of solutions. In this extreme example, we see the general pattern of Carlylean order. Again, order is about the bonds between members of society, which consist of obligations voluntary and involuntary, which are promises made and kept and enforced by law where law is needed to enforce them. Especially critical to Carlyle is the hierarchical bond, the relationship of command, which is one critical form of social glue without which large organizations cannot function. Carlyle, who is not perfect, slightly neglects another important class of obligation, the financial. Financial obligations are more likely to be voluntary, but also more dependent on enforcement. One of my own personal great moments of Carlylean enlightenment was not from Carlyle himself, but from his disciple Froude, also a great historian. To add to the fun, Froude is pronounced just like the way Keanu Reeves says Froude in Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. Someday, I will read all of Froude's 12-volume history of England from Henry VIII through Elizabeth I, but I have only read a bit of the first volume. That bit was so impressive and stunning that I thought I might want to wait a year or two before taking in any more. Froude describes a Tudor society which is completely ordered, which consists, from top to bottom, king to knave, of these relationships of mutual obligation. They are relationships of family, of feudalism, of guild traditions such as apprenticeship, of the church, of political patronage, of commercial patronage and monopoly, and of course of law and government. It was impossible to live a normal human life outside this tapestry, and nor is it at all clear why anyone would have wanted to. Misfits, screw-ups, and parasites constantly fell out of the fabric, the era being after all primitive, and every arm of government was charged with eradicating this human bilge. If Tudor England, or any European sovereign of the era, had tolerated vagrants, beggars, and the idle, it would have been inundated with a mountain of them in a second. As it was, it seems there were quite a few. The difficulty of operating in these primitive conditions demanded a social fabric at which the 21st century can only stare in amazement, like a general contractor contemplating a cathedral. And these people indeed built cathedrals. They were not libertarian cathedrals. Thus, order turns out to equal both truth and justice, because all three equate to promises made and kept. We have seen the reactionary end of the slope of order, Henry VIII. We then look to the radical end of the slope for which we will accept three symbols: Haiti, Afghanistan, and San Francisco. In Haiti, we see one aspect of life without promises made and kept: power, corruption, violence, and filth. In a word, anarchy. Haiti is the product of the persistence of human anarchy, and an excellent symbol because it symbolized exactly the same thing to Carlyle and Froude. The latter visited. His observations were recorded in his travelogue of the trip, The English in the West Indies, or The Bow of Ulysses. Haiti is far more anarchic now than it was in 1888, of course, whose Port-au-Prince is a paradise next to today's. Froude gets all enraged because he sees a ditch full of garbage. The 19th century's Haiti is the 21st's whole third world. If you're interested in this general subject of anarchy in the third world, perhaps you have read Robert Kaplan's famous 1994 essay in The Atlantic, The Coming Anarchy. Kaplan spends most of it berating the reader with a completely fictitious set of causes of this anarchy. The real cause, of course, is decolonialization. The cause of that was progressivism, i.e. Carlyle deficiency. Of course, Kaplan's little anarchies would not surprise Carlyle for a moment. Moreover, as Kaplan does not tell you but Carlyle would, the anarchy is indeed coming to you. Because every year the border between the third world and the first is a little more porous. Here indeed are the seeds of true Ate. Ate? I don't know what that is. The Greek goddess of mischief, delusion, ruin, and folly. Though this thorough and biblical ruin, already taking place in South Africa, may well run another century. No one has yet shown me a magic pill that turns a third worlder into a first worlder. But at least most of the third world is not an active physical danger to the lives of Americans. This cannot be said of Afghanistan, where Americans and other Europeans, and yes, Afghans too, are dying every day for lack of Carlyle. More precisely, they are dying because America, the democratic nation, is and will always be completely incapable of doing the one thing it must do to succeed in Afghanistan, which is to rule the country. Oh no, you see, Americans are in Afghanistan to advise the self-governing Afghan people. Ruling is the last thing they could think of doing. America is just helping the independent government Afghanistan, which of course it created lock, stock, and barrel, to stand on its own 2 feet. But why should it? Do you think these people want America to go away and all America's dollars with it? James Mill once wrote, "The 2 important discoveries for conquering India were, first, the weakness of the native armies against European discipline, and secondly, the facility of imparting that discipline to natives in the European service." End quote. But America has no Afghans in its service. Except for a few interpreters for whom necessity finds a way, the bond of command between American and Afghan is strictly forbidden. It is too Carlylean. Nothing like the Philippine Scouts, for instance, could be tolerated. As a result, Americans are running around screaming, quite ineffectually to the sight of any experienced parent or manager, at their Afghan soldiers that they couldn't smoke hash before going on patrol. It doesn't appear to be working. Thus, Afghans are privileged to receive the full Orwellian force of the 21st century. They suffer the pains of not only anarchy, but also civil war, for an indefinite time period in the future, for the sake of their own human rights. Is this a noble martyrdom or what? If there is any justice in the world, the Afghans may very well inherit it. I'm not sure they will be too nice if they do. The Afghan experience hits a couple of huge Carlylean hot buttons. Not only is it a clear case of anarchy, but it is also a sham. The civil war in Afghanistan continues because of the fraud, clearly palpable to all and defended by none, that the Karzai government is in some sense independent. This is crazy too. He's writing this 12 years ago, and this still is in effect today. The Karzai government could only be more dependent if it were attached by Capitol Hill by an actual physical umbilical cord. And yet, because Washington cannot summon the strength of reality needed to couple authority with dependency, the classic dynamic of mastery, anarchy persists, and so does war. Thus, disorder, mendacity, and injustice again go hand in hand as Satan walks to and fro in the earth. Satan's a pretty busy guy these days. And finally, we come down to San Francisco. This is not Afghanistan, and nor is it Haiti, although the city fathers of 50 years ago might be excused for imagining some relationship. But no, actually, San Francisco is not well governed by any reasonable standard, but I live there and I can tell you that it's a pretty nice place to live. Still, however, the tapestry of promises looks like a moth attack on a dental floss convention. About the only strong human bonds in San Francisco today are familial bonds, and there are precious few of those. Although the birth rate is up about 50% in the last 10 years in my zip code, a thing which makes one think there may be some turning of the tide. Extended families are a rarity. Clans and tribes are found only among the primitive. There are no guilds, there are no real churches, there are no genuine multi-generational neighborhood communal organizations. There are plenty of sexual bonds, friendships, affinity groups, and employment relationships, of course, but everything is casual. Whereas 50 years ago, this city was an American Catholic city full of Irish and Italians. It had community in spades. So did the entire country. America was in fact famous for her social cohesion. If you read Tocqueville's actual American journals, he goes around America marveling at the social fabric, marveling at the strict discipline in the prisons, and being amazed that both can coexist with democracy, whose destructive side, being French, he knows well. It was a tough fabric, and it took more than another century to totally decay. But now, of course, it has, as another famous pundit has pointed out. This other pundit being, it says, Bowling Alone, The Collapse and Revival of American Community is a 2000 nonfiction book by Robert D. Putnam. The same professor has, much against his will, even observed one of the causes. The cause being the downside of diversity. That's one phrase. Whatever. American society is atomized and structureless. All decisions are as procedural and collective as can be made. The only exception is in the corporate, military, and law enforcement worlds, each its own little bitter holdouts of rationalized reaction. These are stubborn, but when they go, commerce and security go. And here is the true slide over the Great Falls. Shooting Niagara. Oh, and Shakespeare and Johnson? They were reactionaries too, of course. Johnson was a notorious Jacobite, but Shakespeare? Alas. Aside from notorious passages such as Ulysses' speech on degree, which you are now fully equipped to understand, not to mention notorious plays such as Coriolanus, let me simply note that if Shakespeare was a Democrat, you'd have heard it. If you must look further, quote, I had as lief be a Brownist as a politician, from Twelfth Night. Note that Brownism begat Congregationalism, and Congregationalism begat Universalism. So we're all Brownists now, by mimetic genealogy at least. Remember that the next time NPR chews your ear off about the Bard, about Shakespeare. Universalism, just so you know, if you haven't read a lot of Moldbug, universalism is his word for the American progressivism, basically, like American popular culture. He calls it universalism, and that's a lot of his writing is fleshing out where it came from and its nature. Last paragraph. And again, don't let this be your only introduction to Carlyle. To repeat the course: Chartism, then the Latter-day Pamphlets, then Shooting Niagara, then the Occasional Discourse. If this doesn't stretch your skull, nothing will. That is Chapter 2 of Moldbug from Mises to Carlyle. Do you have to go to the gym?
Why do I look small?
How much more time do you have?
I got a bit.
Okay. There was just one last thing that I wanted to touch on related to this within this context then. A tweet thread that I did just recently, and let me search for it here real quick. I should have done this earlier. Obligations from... Okay. Okay, so a couple threads that I went through the last couple of days that I wanted to read. So the first one here is this one here. Okay. So I got started on this from a different kind of... So this guy tweeted, Republican Party leadership has absolutely no idea what the average Republican Party voter is like or wants. Absolutely disgusting state of affairs. The disconnect cannot go on forever. And I said, because the Republican Party leadership has been colonized by sycophants who are allowed to occupy their positions because they talk the talk but can be reliably depended upon to not walk the walk. And the people are tired of talk. This is the nature of an outer party. The GOP could have been destroyed years ago. Destroying the second party reveals the game, though. It breaks the trance. Then people realize they are owned and not free. This makes them restless and revolutionary. The masses want to be owned, but they want to pretend that they aren't. They want the rights, but not the responsibility. They want to LARP democracy, where everyone owns himself, but they don't actually want to experience democracy. They don't want to be responsible for themselves. So, by retaining the outer party and even allowing it to win, they encourage people to own their own slavery, to fight for it and protect it with their very lives, to choose it. Hat tip to Kanye West. People are born into slavery. It's our natural state. We will always be bound by our obligations to nature, to society, to God. A king is slave to his people, as his people are slave to him. Rights follow responsibility. If you perform your duty, if you are true to your obligations, you earn the right of whatever privileges afforded those who are true to obligations, such as you have been. Each action has natural consequences. You are constrained only by the obligations you refuse to fulfill. Different people will be asked to fulfill different obligations. To whom much is given, much is asked. To whom much is asked, much is given. And then this other thread here, I said, quote, store up your treasures in heaven means focus on the process, not the results. Focus on fulfilling your obligations. You'll be given more, then fulfill them. Each obligation will be bigger, as will each reward. Start locally and work outward. Freedom is something you create by becoming someone for whom no obligation is too much. When you've established a process so deeply ingrained that you've built a reputation of so many fulfilled obligations, that you've created a life surrounded by the rewards for fulfilling these obligations, ... you can see where that's going. If you establish a process that gets so deeply ingrained to you that you build a reputation with your community as someone who has fulfilled so many obligations, and each time you fulfill those obligations, you're rewarded. So you've built up the rewards, the wealth, the knowledge, the influence, the power of fulfilling all those obligations. This is the matrix. This is the code. The gospel is a code for hacking reality. If you apply the biblical gospel and you embody it in your life, then you're hacking reality. This is the formula for building. Hat tip to the other show, Wealth, Power, and Influence. The other show I do with Jason Stapleton. If you guys aren't familiar with it, you can listen to that. We go live every Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 10 a.m. Follow us on YouTube, Wealth, Power, and Influence, or look it up on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts. End ad. I need to get paid for that one. I'm going to send a bill to Jason. But this reminds me of Scott Adams. He has this whole thing. He says, don't set goals, build systems. Because if you set a goal, then you operate in relation to that goal, and it changes the way that you behave. So better that you establish a system and you embody that system, and then that system can accomplish any goal. But ultimately, another way of framing this is free is he who can pay any price. You have to be, freedom is something you create by becoming someone for whom no obligation is too much. And this is what it means to be king-pilled. Becoming king-pilled means becoming king of your own life, becoming someone who owns every single obligation in front of him and overcomes all of it, solves all of it. When you do that, when you establish a system where you become the king, the owner of everything in your life, you will develop wealth, power, and influence by default. And then you'll be someone who can have a say in what sort of society he lives in, and starts to reform that society. This is the model that humans have used for like all of human history. This was the model. This is why landowners were the guys who had the right to vote, because it was like, okay, well, if he owns land, he's proven himself as someone who fulfills obligations, and he knows the world works. He's made himself successful. He's fulfilled all these obligations. He's trustworthy. He's intelligent. He's competent. He's someone who should have a say in the way the government operates. That was the thinking behind that. So, I think this illustrates why the natural hierarchy, the natural state of human societies, and why there's this tendency toward chaos and away from order, and that right wing is order. It is good. It's right, because God's law is order. It's absolute order. It's the definition of order. That's God's law. And so good government is that which corresponds most closely to God's law, which means a good governor, a king, a CEO, a dictator, whatever you want to call him, if he is good, he will be absolute right wing which means he will be absolutely true to the law of God, which means he will have taken ownership of his own life to the point where he's accumulated so many people who are dependent on him that he is enslaved to the duty and the obligation, the responsibility of caring for them, of providing for them, both spiritually and physically in terms of protection and financially and in every possible way. That is a king. That's the model that's baked into us on a biological, spiritual, anthropological level. That's why order is good. That's why God's law is order, and God is right wing. There you go. Okay. Well, we've gone for a really long time here. I'm sorry I wasn't really able to get into the chat here today, but again, let us know. Do you have anything else you wanted to add, Stephen?
No, I've babbled enough today.
Yeah, you were talking to one today. We're gonna Stephen and I are gonna be meeting together and talking about about some of the stuff that we want to do with the branding and the logo of the show and what we're going to do going forward. And once we get that done, we're going to get a logo here pretty soon. And that's when things are really going to take off. We've got a backlog of interviews that we've got lined up, and things are going places. This is going to be fun. So once again, support our sponsor, Paloma Verde, Carlos and Vanessa. They're good people. Go to palomaverdestore.com. That's PALOMAVERDE store.com. Use promo code KING for 25% off any order over $75. And if you sign up for their mailing list, you also get an additional 10% off. So you can get 35% off your first order there. And follow me on Twitter at RealKingPilled. And subscribe, like, share the show, all that good stuff. Follow Liberal Steve on Twitter at Messina Inc. And there's nowhere where you can follow Steven. He's not available anywhere on the internet. And I think that's it. Oh, one last thing. Do me a favor when you listen, you get to this point. I'll say this because only the people who get to this point will be the ones who've listened to the whole thing. So they're the ones who are the most into it. Let me know what you thought of this episode, what you thought of this format that we're using, that we're doing these live readings and with the commentary. Do you like the commentary? Is it too much? Do you like it when I go down the little rabbit holes with the definitions and stuff? Give me some feedback. Let me know what your thoughts are. Let me know your thoughts on the actual subject, on the Moldbug's outline of Carlisle and Carlisle's theory about order and about shaved ice and all of that. Give us your thoughts. Let us know what you think. And we will be back again on Monday at probably about 1 p.m. Pacific, like we were today. And that is all, folks. Thanks. We'll see you next time.